Hello and welcome to the Thursday, December 11th, 2025 edition of the SANS Internet Storm Center's Stormcast. My name is Johannes Ulrich, recording today from Jacksonville, Florida. And this episode is brought to you by the SANS.edu Master's Degree Program in Information Security Engineering. Well, in diaries today, we do have a detect that I associate with a Kubernetes vulnerability that was patched last year, an OS Command Injection vulnerability. This vulnerability was a fairly straightforward OS Command Injection in the node log query feature. Wasn't widely exploited in part because, at least at the time, this feature was still in beta and wasn't enabled by default. Also, the user, in order to attack this feature, must have the privileges to actually query logs. Now, the way the exploit works was you just sent essentially data to the logs endpoint, and the pattern parameter was injectable. Now, the OS Command Injection, there are a couple different ways how to often do that, with like backticks or pipes or ampersand. In this case, the attack worked by enclosing the operating system commands in parentheses, leading with a dollar symbol. So that very common shell extrapolation that is often used for these types of attacks. Well, today I was actually looking for some React exploits. And while sort of going through my logs, I found this other request that reminded me a little bit of this particular Kubernetes vulnerability. So I wonder if it's related. However, in this case, the OS Command Injection is not a command line parameter. Instead, it's part of the URL. But it still uses that same dollar parentheses pattern. Also, still at the end of the URL, we have a static string /logs/, just like for the Kubernetes vulnerability. So if anybody has any ideas what this could be about, let me know, but maybe sort of a slightly different variant of the exploit to hit the same vulnerability, or maybe something new and different. And then talking about react2shell, Wiz has a real nice blog summarizing some of the attacks that are currently going around. Pretty much matches what we are seeing as well. And also a couple of additional details about this particular vulnerability. One point I think that's important to make here is that currently we do see pretty much all the exploits, so specifically targeting Next.js. And that's sort of what's also visible then in respective headers and such. So some people may use that to filter requests, which is probably a good idea if you're not using React or Next.js. But the problem is that, it's not really a Next.js vulnerability. The vulnerability is in the React server components, and Next.js is just a more popular way how these RSCs are exposed. So other components may also expose them, and the exploit may work with some modifications, as Wiz points out, without Next.js, but if you're using instead some other additions that are taking advantage of React server components. So keep that in mind when you're setting up your filters. Again, these web application firewall filters that are commonly being proposed here, they aren't perfect. They are meant to buy you time. They're not supposed to, substitute patching. And then we got a new update for Notepad++. Now, typically I don't talk about Notepad++ updates, but this one fixes an interesting and already exploited security issue. Apparently, Notepad++ didn't verify signatures when it downloaded updates. And yes, often you can get away with this, but in this case, it has already been exploited by entities hijacking traffic to Notepad++ servers. So this is the only really significant issue being fixed. And yes, these attacks do happen. So be careful how you are updating your software. Make sure you're verifying any certificates of servers that you may be connecting to, but also verify the executable you're downloading itself by checking respective signatures. Then we have an interesting privilege escalation vulnerability in Mac OS that currently has not been patched yet and is relatively straightforward to exploit. It's actually very similar to an older vulnerability that was patched last year, and I'll link to the older vulnerability in the show notes. The newer one, haven't really seen sort of a decent write-up of it, so sort of bits and pieces across social media. Maybe I'll find something, and if so, then I'll add it. But the fundamental problem here is that, of course, when you're running an installer to install some packages, well, the installer runs as root. But the problem is that this installer may then also, use resources on the system. And one of these resources is C shell, the default shell on Mac OS. And a user may prepare a malicious C profile file that's then being loaded at the beginning of executing a C shell. And of course, the user is able to manipulate that file. It's owned by the user and can execute commands as root as a result. So interesting little vulnerability. I was actually sort of hoping that Apple would release updates today. They're sort of due to release updates this week. Maybe we'll see them tomorrow, and then I'll point out in case this vulnerability is being addressed. Well, and that's it for today. And thanks again for any likes and recommendations. And this week, as I mentioned before, would be nice if a couple people would leave some good comments with Apple Podcast. Let me know if you did so. And that's it for today. Thanks, and talk to you again tomorrow. Bye.